Welcome to the Mindful Academy podcast with me, Jennifer Askey. I'm a professional certified coach and academic workplace consultant. On this podcast, I talk about doing well personally so that you can perform well professionally. I talk about intentional career planning and about how to get out of your own way and align yourself with success. Thank you for joining me. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Mindful Academy with me, Jennifer Askey, professional certified coach and friend to academic professionals. My professional friend? I don't know. So today's episode is titled, Are You an Unnecessarily Miserable Academic? I wrote a post about this on LinkedIn a while back, and it got a lot of resonance, so I thought I would revisit that topic in a podcast. So let's start with the signs that you might be an unnecessarily miserable academic. So first sign, hypervigilance, waiting for the other shoe to drop. You might think of this as an elevated form of imposter syndrome. And imposter syndrome as a concept was introduced decades ago, referring specifically to women who were socialized to experience quite acutely the feeling that they did not belong and would be found out as frauds. And of course, that is easily extended to all sorts of groups of people who are on the margins or who experience themselves as on the margins of the systems that they're a part of. So in academia, if you are a woman, if you're a person of color, if you are a first generation academic, I do find it quite fascinating how academia can run in families, and the experience of those of subsequent generations of academics are different than for people who maybe were the first in their families to go to college or university, the first in their families to get PhDs, right? These are different experiences that might elevate, exacerbate, increase your chances of feeling imposter syndrome at one time or another. But hypervigilance is, being on alert for all of the things that can go wrong, all of the ways in which you might be missing out, not understanding, not included, not good enough, right? This shows up oftentimes as a sense of needing assurance, looking for, this is my personal favorite, looking for the magic pill or the silver bullet. Like, oh, if I just do that, it'll all be okay. So it's a not feeling safe in your environment, not feeling like you belong, and being on alert to how you're going to fail, how you're going to be excluded. And there are many manifestations of that. I'll just invite you to think, in what ways might you be engaging in hypervigilance at work? Another sign of being an unnecessarily miserable academic is frantic action. So frantic action is all the things all the time, right? So you are everywhere for everyone. You're at every conference, you're at every committee meeting, you put your hand up for everything. When I see this happening, and I know I did this in my first couple of years as a tenure track faculty member, frantic action for me and for people that I coach grows out of not really knowing what's expected of you. And so just assuming that if you do all the things all the time for all the people with all the effort, you might approach okay enough to be kept on. And this, of course, is super convenient for organizations who can get maximum work out of you, not super convenient for your long-term viability as a scholar, because you will burn out. And frantic action is also a manifestation of people pleasing, right? And I mean, I understand that if you are contingent, if you are pre-tenure, if you are in some way systematically vulnerable in your position right now, yes, absolutely. It makes sense to maybe go the extra mile, or to think of yourself as engaged in some sort of quid pro quo where you will do for them and then eventually they will do for you. You will be loyal to the institution, to the department, to the people first, and then that loyalty will come back to you. I think that 9 times out of 10, that math is silly and you should not engage in it. Because loyalty isn't really what gets us jobs, isn't what allows you to keep jobs, isn't even what allows you to progress and take on leadership roles or get promoted, right? And if it does, then that's capricious and also no fun. But this notion that if you play the game right, you will be rewarded, that flies in the face of economic realities, competing priorities that institutions have to deal with, right? It's not good logic to assume that people pleasing is a way forward, even though there are a lot of narratives that will invite you to think that it is. People pleasing, of course, gets you in hot water with yourself in lots of ways, because you do all the things for all the people, you're frantically in action, doing things. And after a while of being frantically in action and doing things, you can build up a lot of resentment towards your work. Like, I'm doing all this stuff, and yet I still don't see the results. Or I'm doing all this stuff and I'm not getting the kudos and gold stars that I want, right? We can't read one another's minds. So you engaging in frantic action as a way to cement yourself in a place or with people, people who are not contingent, people who don't operate on that people-pleasing front may just think that what you want to do and that you aren't engaged in this as in some sort of quid pro quo in your own mind. So investigating in your own mind, is this frantic action, like, are you expecting something in return for that? And are you expecting something because you're engaged in one side of a conversation around loyalty, around quid pro quo, around earning and deserving, but the institution or the other people are actually not involved in the other side of that conversation? So frantic action is also exhausting, right? It's another sign that you are perhaps creating more misery in your life and in your job than you need to. The third one I want to talk about, and there are hosts of these, I'll probably return to this topic again, but another sign that you might be creating unnecessary misery or drama in your job is perfectionism. And there are, of course, lots of examples of how to be a perfectionist. There are lots of examples of how perfectionism actually gets in your own way. My Facebook banner used to say, perfectionism is really just fear in fancy shoes, or something like that, which is true. So some examples of perfectionism are, this paper or this book isn't ready yet. It will be ready when. Right? Another example of perfectionism is, I'm going to redo my syllabi every semester, every year. Perfectionism is also, my slides are not merely informative and provide a scaffold for my classes, but they are works of art. And each one is a little gem showing how much I care. Sometimes I call this, or experience it from my clients, as completionism, where they're conducting research in order to write something, and they follow footnotes and endnotes and find additional sources and keep digging and keep digging. And that rabbit hole never comes to an end. There's always one more thing to read. This notion of like shoring yourself up against any potential criticism by reading, and not just being familiar with, but intimately knowing every tiny tangential thing that might have some sort of impact on your work. Whether this is like how you put your slides together, or the research that you do, right? That you need to dot every I, cross every T, and go down that rabbit hole as deep and as far as it will go to make sure that nobody can ever spring a gotcha on you. Of course, doing your research, doing due diligence, that's what's expected. But this notion of, oh, but I haven't read that thing from the 1980s, right? Like I hear a lot of people delaying making their own scholarly contribution in sort of a frantic Easter egg hunt for making sure that they've read everything that has ever been said about this through all time and in all languages. Or they mention a concept and they use the concept and they know the basics of that concept. They've done some research on that concept, but then they have to go back to the beginning of when that concept originated in its own field and do a whole nother research study in order to feel equipped to use a word, right? That kind of perfectionism and completionism gets in the way of your success and creates unnecessary misery. Now, the things that I just mentioned, so 3 of 1,000 things, right? Hypervigilance, frantic action and people pleasing, and perfectionism and control and completionism. There are things about those that are going to make you feel really good and really proud of yourself, right? And I don't want to get in the way of or suggest that you should not feel proud of yourself. But if the overall trend of that behavior isn't towards contentment, then I suggest that you are contributing to your own misery. So if, digging into extra research, going down a rabbit hole, if that's fun and engaging and doesn't get in the way of you actually making the contribution, as we say here in Canada, fill your boots, right? Knock yourself out. If, however, it produces additional anxiety, like that's the first sign that you are diving headlong into behavior that not only gets in the way of you making your scholarly contribution, but actively contributes to your discontentment, right? So overall arc of contentment, overall arc of pride versus overall arc of, oh my goodness, this is anxiety producing, this is fear generating. And I'm just going to suggest that, like, don't do things that increase your anxiety. Right? We learn to manage our anxiety. Anxiety is a nice signal for things, but like, don't dive into things that are just making you miserable. Okay. So what I want you to hear about perfectionism and hypervigilance and people pleasing is that these qualities come with light and shadow, right? Good sides and bad sides. So I learned this pretty late in life through assessments and coach training. Right? I didn't major in psychology. I never took a psychology class. I was a grad student, I think, before I read anything by Jung. So I came to these concepts later in life. Maybe they're old hat to you, but for a lot of you, they won't be. For a lot of you, they'll be new as well. This notion that our assets and skills, right? For example, diligence and rigor, have a shadow side, which might be anxiety-oriented perfectionism. Our asset of relatability, sensitivity to others' needs and feelings, empathy, might have the shadow side of people-pleasing. Our asset of long-range planning, strategic thinking, big picture, risk management, although I have mixed feelings about whether risk management is an asset, but again, that might differ from personality to personality. But those things have as their shadow side a hypervigilance that is stultifying, that is inhibitive, right? So the goal here is to recognize and celebrate your talents without letting the associated weaknesses of those talents like swoop in and take over. And that work of managing the associated weaknesses is I mean, a quick way to say it is that's the work of adulthood, right? Is to recognize strengths and weaknesses and figure out what strengths you really want to deploy on a regular basis, what their associated weaknesses are, and how you manage those things, right? So whether we're talking about managing anxiety, or talking about managing distractibility, or talking about managing people pleasing, right? It is okay that those things happen, but how do you deal with them when you know that they're going to happen, right? Okay, my danger in going into this project is that I will, instead of following an agenda that works for the project and works for my career, I will not think of my career and my goals at all. I will totally devote myself to other human beings and their interests and get completely lost in that, resulting in my own resentment, right? That's a danger for a people pleaser. So managing that looks like, okay, I'm going to be involved in this project. This is my role in the project. This is what I'm getting out of it. And as mature adults, people involved in the project are all clearly expressing what their role is and what they hope to get out of it, so that we get to work towards everybody's benefit and not have some people work for the benefit of the rest, right? So that's mature management of your own associated weaknesses, is being able to communicate clearly about them, set up systems that allow you to recognize them when they happen and stop yourself from getting completely derailed, right? That emotional self-management that's a lifelong project, right? But it starts with being aware of how we get in our own way. And so right now I'm framing this in terms of how you might be making yourself unnecessarily miserable. Another way to combat unnecessary misery is to surround yourself with supportive peers and mentors. So for example, and I've maybe mentioned this before, in my tenure track faculty role, long ago and far away, I was probably 3 years into that, maybe even longer, before I heard a colleague in another humanities discipline talk about the upcoming semester and say that it was a pretty light prep load because they were teaching some large lecture classes, because they taught the courses before, so they had all their notes and their slides. No, they didn't have slides. This was like 2008. There were no slides, but they had all their notes. I was floored. My first thought was, oh my gosh, you're not offering fresh content every semester, right? That was my inner critic piping up. I did not open my mouth and say that, because immediately on the heels of my inner critic piping up with that super judgy thought was, oh my gosh, like, she's teaching ethics or 19th century history or a survey of children's lit or whatever, and you don't need fresh content every semester. Sure, revitalize it every few years when you get bored, but recreating your own wheel every single time you teach a class just because. I had no idea that was even possible until a supportive peer mentioned it. And so the role of a supportive community that shares, like, this is how I'm approaching this, this is what works for me, mentors who are like, oh, hey, you might want to think about doing it this way, with generosity and giving as the motives there. And let's acknowledge that those kinds of communities are not obvious in the academic world. Maybe you have a co-writing group where you read each other's work and offer critique, and maybe yours is super supportive. Some aren't, right? Some are, they're really into the feedback and use that as a way to demonstrate their critical thinking and rigor. Maybe people in the group are using it as a way to compare, right? Shore up their own sense of self-worth, right? We bring our emotions to this work. So if you have a peer group, whether they're local to you or virtual, where it really is about let's build a brain trust. Let's work on the premise that a rising tide lifts all boats. Let's share our experiences for the purposes of uplifting people rather than just for the purposes of polishing our egos. I say this and kind of go into descriptions of how it might not work well, because I've witnessed more than once that, especially coming out of graduate school, where in competitive programs, in a lot of programs, graduate students are almost encouraged to vie for attention. We're vying for jobs, right? Where profiling yourself comes with the territory, that sometimes those groups do not naturally lend themselves to the supportive peer group you need if you're going to establish the self-management techniques to get out of your own way and get work done. Right? If you are surrounded by people who are feeding into the weaknesses that you have, the weaknesses associated with your particular skill set and gifts, right? Those might not be your best peers for learning to get out of your own way or learning to emotionally manage some of your tendencies or first impulse knee-jerk reactions to things. It is great to have peers and mentors whose not only do you admire their work, but you admire how they get it done, right? You admire the whole package so that you're all collectively involved in a project of being well, right? In order to do good work, increasing your own well-being while you are also being good scholars. And I think that those things go hand in hand in supportive groups. Right? This is how I manage to keep my grading load down, right? That's sharing how somebody might manage a tendency towards that completionism, right? This is how I manage to provide really good feedback and have it not suck all my life out of me. This is how I manage to review articles for a journal, but I don't take an entire weekend to do it, right? How much time do you spend on this? How much effort do you give to that? So that it's like talking about our salaries, right? Talking about your time budget is a lot like talking about your financial budget, where transparency actually benefits everybody. And it certainly benefits people who are first generation scholars, new to the area, don't have a big network, right? And new in their careers. So that sort of transparency in a supportive group can really help you see a larger terrain than just the terrain in your head, because if you're only involved in the terrain in your head, then ooh, there's the rabbit hole for you. I have a lot more to say about how we get in our own way, how I see my clients getting in their own way, how we get out of their own way. I will put a plug, just like I did in the last episode, I'll put a plug in again just for noticing. And that sounds so simple. But noticing is actually incredibly rigorous. Noticing is the practice of establishing self-awareness. So let's say you're feeling stressed out and miserable. I can use the metaphor of like, that is your hand on a hot burner on a stove. And you want to take your hand off pretty quickly. But in order to remove your hand, you need to first register the pain. Right? And with a hand on a hot stove, that's an automatic circuit, right? You're going to yoink. In fact, I burned my middle finger on my left hand the other day, pulling something out of the oven, and my hand slipped off the hot pad. And I had jerked my hand away before I felt any sensation, right? My body knew, like, bah. When it comes to our own contentment versus dissatisfaction, our own capacity for fulfillment and joy versus misery, we need to build, most of us need to build that feedback cycle where, oh, okay, I am actually experiencing stress, unhappiness, anxiety, right? Where is it coming from? When do I feel it most? When do I feel it least? The noticing is the first step. And noticing in and of itself is a mindful strategy. Because noticing isn't like, I'm going to notice it, and then I'm going to go into a detailed analysis of how I got here, why I do it, what it looks like, all of the faults of the people and situations that trigger it in me. Right? Noticing isn't analyzing or justifying. It's taking note and then kind of letting it go. But if you notice over and over and over again, then you notice the pattern. And then you are in a better position to actually shift behaviors, actually shift thought patterns. So a dedicated practice of noticing is one critical element in mindfulness. And if you pair it with another critical mindfulness element, which is non-judgmental, non-attachment to non-judgment and non-attachment to that noticing, to that thought that you've just had, then you're well on your way to more control over your equanimity. I've recommended this before, and I will come back to it again and again. A very short, beautiful book, now in its 30th year of publication, called Taming Your Gremlins, that goes deeply into the habit of just noticing and paying attention to yourself. So I am all about helping you become a less miserable academic, a more contented and fulfilled academic, a more thriving academic. And I hope that you found today interesting. If you did, share it with somebody. I would love to hear how you responded to it. I would love to know that you're sharing it. You can find me on LinkedIn as Jennifer Askey Coach, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Mindful Academy podcast. For questions about this episode, suggestions for future episodes, or to request a consultation with me, email me at jennifer@jenniferaskey.com. This episode was recorded in Edmonton, Alberta on Treaty 6 lands. The songs included in the intro and outro for this podcast are Heartache by Silent Partner and Piano Store by Jimmy Fontanez of Media Right Productions, both sourced through the audio library. Thank you so much for listening.